So I'd like to talk today about a particular class of risk, which is emergent risk, which has this nickname of Black Swans. And we'll come to why that might be in just a moment. I'm sure you've heard the term. But I'd like to start with just outlining some of the characteristics of the future. The future using this acronym of DANGER. There are 6 characteristics of the future which make it particularly subject to uncertainty. The first is that the future is dynamic. It's not static. Things are changing very quickly. We might use the word volatile in the VUCA context, perhaps, but things are changing very rapidly as we move into the future. And as we move into the future, things are also ambiguous. We're not entirely sure what it is that we're seeing. We look at things from different perspectives and different people see different things. So ambiguity is a characteristic of the future. The future is non-linear. We can't draw a straight line from the past and project forwards into the future and just assume that things will continue as they were before. So that non-linearity, the hockey stick effects and those kinds of things make it very difficult to work out what's going to happen in the future. You might have come across this word, the word glocal, which is a combination of global and local, the interaction between things on different levels as we move into the future. So we have things that are happening on the global scale, which affect us in our micro environment, in our businesses, in our projects, in our families and communities. And similarly, we can have things that are happening very small, very locally, which because of connectivity end up having a very large global effect. So there's this kind of multi-level effect. And then we have the future being emergent, where things come at us completely unexpectedly, out of left field, you might say, things which we couldn't predict and couldn't foresee. And finally, the future is relational. So it's not a question of things happening in isolation or in silos. Everything is linked together. Connectivity in our world is much tighter and broader than it ever has been before. And these 6 characteristics make the future very difficult to predict. Each of these 6 characteristics is worth looking at in some detail, but we're going to focus today on just the one which is covered by the word emergent, and particularly look at emergent risks. Now, emergent risks have other names. I'm going to give you some easy names and some difficult names. Unknowable unknowns. I guess we've all heard of unknown unknowns, known unknowns, known knowns, all of those things. But these are not just unknown unknowns. Emergent risks are unknowable. That's because they're a type of uncertainty which is known as ontological uncertainty. Ontological uncertainty comes from our worldview or our type of conception, our frame of reference. And unknowable unknowns or ontological uncertainty are uncertainties which arise because of our way of thinking, the way that we see the world, things which are literally outside of our ability to perceive or even conceive them. They are literally inconceivable. They're things that we could not imagine as being possibly true until they emerge. And then we see them fully formed in front of us as a complete surprise. And this term Black Swans comes from a book written in 2007 by Taleb, introduced this idea of the Black Swan as a type of risk that we need to be aware of. And he gave 3 tests, 3 characteristics of the Black Swan. A lot of people these days are using the term Black Swan to refer to something which has an extremely low probability and an extremely high impact. And I'd like to tell you that that is not the way that Taleb intended this term to be used. He intended it to be used for things that are completely inconceivable and unpredictable because they are ontological uncertainties outside of our frame of reference. We could never think of it, no matter how hard we sat down and how much time we spent on it. We could never imagine this type of risk. It is a risk that if it does happen, when it does happen, it has an extreme impact. And the other characteristic that Taleb attaches to the term Black Swan is that when one occurs and we look back on it, we say, do you know what, we should have seen that coming. It appears to be obvious after it's happened. And the term arises from the fact that in Europe and the Western world in the 16th century, the 17th century, we knew for certain that all swans were white. Big birds, long necks, big wings, they live on the water, and they're white. If you see a bird that looks like it's got big wings and a long neck and it lives on the water, but it's not white, it's not a swan. By definition, all swans are white, until we discovered Australia. And in Australia, there were birds that were big and lived on water, big wings, long neck, but they were black. And so clearly they couldn't be swans, because swans by definition are white. The idea of a black swan is completely inconceivable until we found one. And initially they were given a different scientific name. They were thought to be a separate genus until they brought them back to London. And we actually did some tests in the Natural History Museum, and we discovered that actually they are exactly the same species apart from different coloured feathers. And so the concept of a black swan is something you can't imagine until you find one. I guess maybe a pink swan might be something similar these days. It couldn't possibly happen, could it? So let me illustrate or show you how Taleb illustrates the way that black swans emerge. And he used the idea of a turkey to illustrate this. And if you imagine you were a turkey living on a farm, and this is your well-being chart from the day that you hatch as time goes forward. And so 100% well-being is that things are good. A well-being above 100% means things are getting better. Below 100% means that things are getting worse. And as you grow up on the farm and the farmers look after you and they feed you and they water you and they're very kind to you, everything is great, your well-being increases until a day comes when you're about 3 months old and suddenly something occurs, something completely unexpected. And that something is, well, for you guys over there, it's Thanksgiving. For us over here, it might be Christmas. And the turkey has no idea that Thanksgiving or Christmas is coming. Its experience tells it that life gets better and better day by day. They're provided for, they're cared for very well, their well-being increases. And why should anything appear to be different in the future until it happens? And so Thanksgiving for the turkey is a complete ontological uncertainty. It couldn't even imagine that such a thing occurs until it occurs. And so this is the illustration that Taleb uses, amongst others, in his book to describe the sorts of risks that emerge completely unforeseen, and then they hit us really hard. So we might use other terms to describe black swans, terms like disruptive inventions or crossover technologies or game changers, things which completely change things in a way that we could never have seen coming until it arrives. Maybe I should give you some examples. Let's go back into the fairly recent past. For example, the arrival of the internet in 1982, not even 40 years ago. Who could have imagined the connectivity that was possible, having the entire knowledge base of the entire world at our fingertips in an instant? Unimaginable. Or in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the collapse of communism. In the late 90s and the early noughties, we had the invention of social media, the Google search engine, Facebook and Twitter, with these being their original logos. How about the global financial crisis in 2008? Nobody saw it coming until it hit us really hard, and it was completely unexpected. When we looked back, we said, well, of course we should have seen it coming with that subprime, the way that things were developing in the subprime market. A little more recently, we might think about the oil price crisis in 2014, or the migrant crisis in 2015 in Europe, where we had mass movements of people from the Middle East and Africa across into Europe. Now, who thought that Britain would ever leave the European Union in 2016 when we had that vote? And lo and behold, suddenly UK is not part of the European Union. I won't tell you which way I voted, but I can tell you for sure I really was surprised when I woke up and discovered that that was what we'd all voted for. And how about your dear beloved, recently departed president? Nobody quite expected that he would really make it to the White House, did they? And of course he did. Maybe he was a black swan too. And how about this? How about the coronavirus, which arrived last year? Do we think the coronavirus is a black swan? Do you think the coronavirus is inconceivable and unpredictable with an extreme impact, but looking back, the pandemic should have been obvious? Well, I'm here to tell you that actually the coronavirus pandemic is not a black swan, because it is absolutely not unpredictable. In fact, it was not even unpredicted. The coronavirus pandemic was predicted time and time and time again in the recent past. And this reference to this YouTube video here is on my YouTube channel, the Risk Doctor Video YouTube channel, a short 7-minute video presenting the evidence for predicting the coronavirus pandemic before it happened. In fact, in October 2019, there was a simulation exercise in the UK for a respiratory virus pandemic. And we simulated what would happen and what we would do if it occurred. And then we agreed 7 different things that needed to be done in order to improve our preparation. We just didn't get around to doing it before the thing actually arrived. And the United Nations, the World Health Organization, all across all of the major organizations predicted another pandemic like the 1918 Spanish flu. We just didn't make the preparations. So the coronavirus pandemic was not a black swan, but I'll tell you what was a black swan, and that was global lockdown. In February 2020, my wife and I were in South Africa, and the coronavirus started up. We saw it was there in China, then in Iran. And in China, they shut down the city of Wuhan. They shut down the province. They made people stay at home. And then it arrived in Italy. And I said to my wife, you know, China can shut down everything and they can lock down their citizens. That's the kind of society that they are. You know, that kind of lockdown, we could never do that in Europe. Can you imagine the Italians being told to stay at home and them actually doing it? Inconceivable. And then before we knew it, the whole world seemed to be in lockdown. And we caught the last plane out of Cape Town, South Africa, to get home back to the UK, the last plane before they shut South Africa behind us and we weren't allowed to travel anymore. Who foresaw the global lockdown? That truly was a black swan. And coming out of it, the inability to travel internationally, which we're still just about coming out of, the huge mountains of debt that governments piled up as they tried to deal with the results of the pandemic. Completely inconceivable until it happened. And still today, we're suffering from some of the results of that global pandemic in the way that the supply chain has become clogged up and blockages in the supply chain, things that we expected to be arriving just in time are not arriving at all. And so we've got supply chain problems coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, which we didn't foresee. So these are the sorts of things, these things which are emerging unexpectedly outside of our frame of reference, which could cause problems, or which did cause problems when they arrived, which we would categorize as black swans. And what are the black swans going to be for next year? Who knows? We really can't say. We have no idea what's coming because it's inconceivable. If I could say to you, well, of course it will be this, because I've told you what it is, then that by definition is not inconceivable, and therefore it's not a black swan. So we can't say what the future might hold in terms of emergent risk. And we have to remember, of course, that not all black swans are bad. If we think about things like the internet or social media or some of these other things that I've mentioned, actually, they have a good side. Some of the emergent risks could be opportunities and not just threats. There might be good things that emerge, which we weren't expecting, which were inconceivable, which have a huge positive impact. So we've got these things which we can look back in history and say, yeah, that was one, and that was one. And where's the next one? We really don't know, which gives us a problem. If we're talking about hunting black swans or handling emergent risk, if it's unknowable, does that mean it's unmanageable? What can we possibly do to prepare for something that we can't conceive, something that is outside of our frame of reference? Is there anything at all that we could do that would help us, apart from having a sip of water? Well, just because it's unknowable doesn't mean it's unmanageable. There are 2 areas that we could focus on that would help us to handle emergent risk. The first is to look for the types of things which contribute to the emergence of black swans. Are there global causes which make black swans more likely, which lead to their emergence? And the second is, are there areas which could be hit if a black swan arrived, which we need to prepare, which we need to identify and aim to protect in advance? We can look for global causes and local effects, which could help us to handle black swans, even though we don't know precisely what they might be. So let's look at these 2 halves of the equation in turn, excuse me. First of all, global causes. How do we identify things that we can't imagine? What we need to do is to have an effective scanning process that scans our environment to spot where things might be arising, looking for early warning indicators and triggers that might tell us that an emerging risk is on the way. Excuse me. And I'd like to suggest two sources for you of these early warning indicators. One comes from the International Risk Governance Council, IRGC, and the other comes from the World Economic Forum, the WEF. In 2010, and it is quite a long time ago, the IRGC issued a report, which was, I have it here, the emergence of risks, what are the contributing factors? And in this report, they identified 10 global causes of emergent risk. And this report, which is about 30 pages long, looks at each of these in turn and describes them in some detail, explaining what they are and why they're important. So things like pure scientific unknowns, things that we couldn't imagine until science unveiled them or exposed them. We have positive feedback loops in the way that things operate, creating vicious and virtuous cycles. We have things where conflicts of interests lead one group of people to develop one thing which is conflicting with what somebody else is doing. When those things hit each other, they create risks which we hadn't foreseen. We have unbalanced information where some people are in possession of some information, others are in possession of other information. We have malicious actors, of course. And all of these things we can identify, we can track, we can put them into our horizon scanning, scan the future and see which of these are arising. And the biggest thing to look for is not just these things on their own, but where they are interacting with each other and compounding their effects in leading to emergent risk. The other good source is the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report. And this is published every year. This is the cover of the 2021 report, which came out just a few months ago. And they have within the report, by drawing on the inputs and the insights of hundreds of different risk experts around the world, they monitor and track the risks which are arising in the risk landscape globally. And they plot a map, and here's the current map from the report. It's a little hard to read, but I'll come back to that in just a moment, which puts for probability or likelihood on the horizontal impact, horizontal axis, impact on the vertical axis, something like 30 or 35 different risks which they think are emerging globally. And if we wanted to pick out the ones that have the highest impact, which are across the top, or the ones which have the highest likelihood, which are along the right-hand side, these are picked out in the report here. So we can see that the top global risks by likelihood are extreme weather, climate action failure, and human environmental damage. Some of that might sound familiar to you, followed by infectious diseases, which are still, up there in the top 10. In terms of the size of the impact, the World Economic Forum foresee infectious diseases having the biggest impact, which they are currently doing, climate action failure, and weapons of mass destruction, which could be really big. But although these things are there in the landscape with the horizon that we're looking at, they have different timelines. So what the report also does is picks out the top 5 risks in the immediate 0 to 2 year time frame, the midterm 3 to 5 years, or the long term 5 to 10 years. And you can see here the things that we're immediately having to face are infectious diseases, livelihood crisis with the cost of living changing, with the results of the pandemic making it hard for people to work and so on, weather, which is arising across the world, cybersecurity, and digital inequality. But there are other things which you might see coming in the midterm, most of which have to do with economic impacts. And then the long-term risks in terms of state collapse, biodiversity, or natural resource crises. Without going into the detail of whether we agree or disagree with these things, it's important just to say that this report is updated every year and is a rich source of emerging trends, of early warnings, of trigger indicators, which if you link it together with the IRGC 10 causes, 10 emergent causes, you can create quite a powerful map of how the future might be panning out. Why is that helpful? Because it helps us to prepare in advance for things that we can't see. If there was some issue of, let's say, state collapse linked with a debt crisis, which is emerging in the next three to 5 year period, driven by malicious actors combined with scientific discoveries, what could we do about that? And this is where we switch to the other side of the equation, looking at global causes and local impacts or local effects. How do we handle the local effects that black swans might have on us, on me and my projects, on me and my business, on me and my community, me and my nation? And so what we're doing here is looking at, on the one side, where these things might come from, but on the other side, why they might matter, what they could do to us if and when they arise. Now, we're all interested in risk management, and of course, we have a wide range of standard risk response strategies in our armory that we normally use when we're handling risk. And these include standard strategies for threats, where we seek to avoid or transfer or mitigate or accept our threats. We also have a set of standard responses for opportunities, where we might consider exploiting or capturing some good opportunities or sharing them with others who can help us to make them real. Enhancing opportunities to improve them before we capture them, or accepting them with a contingency plan. Now, could we use our standard risk responses to handle black swans in advance? Actually, we can't. The problem is that standard responses don't work for emergent risks, because by the time an emergent risk emerges, it's too late. They arrive fully formed in front of us, and we have to have to deal with them as they are. We can't be proactive if we're using these response strategies to deal with black swans. So what we need is a completely different approach to handle the things that we can't see, that we don't know about, but we know they're coming. We know where they're coming from because we can track the global causes and the trigger events. We could see why they might affect us, but we need a different approach for handling them. What might that approach be? Well, let me suggest to you that there are two generic strategies that we can use to prepare for black swans, even if we don't know what they are. The first of these is flexibility. Flexibility is defined as the ability to bend without breaking, or adaptability. There's a Chinese proverb: the bamboo that bends is stronger than the oak that resists, because when something resists, it resists until its strength is gone and then it breaks. Whereas the bamboo that bends, bends and bends, and when the wind eases, it just recovers. Flexibility is a risk response strategy that we can build into our projects, our organizations, our societies, in order to be able to cope with the things that we didn't see coming when they arrive. So flexibility is one key strategy, and the other is resilience, a word that you'll probably have heard quite a lot of. The capacity to maintain our purpose and integrity in the face of challenge, the capability to retain our original shape after deformation. I use the word bounce back ability. Something hits you and the ability to bounce back. Resilience is running a marathon, not running a sprint. Being able to continue. I use the phrase COCO, keep on keeping on. If you keep on keeping on, that's a mark of resilience. So flexibility and resilience are our two key risk response strategies that help us to prepare in advance for things that we don't know about, things that we hadn't seen coming, things that arose from that sort of mist of the future and arrived fully formed straight in front of us with extreme impact, but the potential to really disrupt us, but we respond with flexibility and resilience. So how do we do that? Often in our businesses and in our projects, we tend to think of our projects as rather like the image on the left, rather like a train track. And if we think of a business with a strategic plan, then the train track is our strategic plan. It lays down on the track, this is where we're starting, this is where we want to finish. These are our goals and objectives. Along the way, we have stations where we stop. These are our milestones or our waypoints or our gates, where we'll have interim milestones on our way to our final destination. We have a ticket price. There's a cost to get on the train in order to go from here to our destination. There's a schedule. I was going to say schedule. There's a schedule, a timetable, which allows us to start here. We know we'll arrive at this station at this time and this station at this time. And we just get on the train and our business leaves the station and we pass along our track and we arrive eventually at our destination. Is that true? Is that what your business is like? Is that what your projects and programs are like? You just lay out the track and then you start your project and you finish on time, having hit all the stations along the way right on schedule. I think it's not like that at all, is it? The reality is that businesses and projects and programs are much more like that image on the right-hand side, sailing a small boat across some open water in the face of winds and tides and things crossing in front of you and people falling overboard and all sorts of strange things happen. And you have to respond to the situation which you find yourself in. So you might need to, you can set your objective. You want to get to this point on the other side of the bay, and you might have a required or a preferred arrival time. But as soon as you set out and the winds start up and you hit the waves, you have to adjust your course. You might need to tack in this direction and then you go this direction. You're pointing slightly off and then you adjust your direction to go this way until eventually you arrive on the other side. So in order to sail the boat, we need flexibility and resilience, which we don't find on the train track. So how can we develop flexibility and resilience? I'd like to suggest 4 levels that we can do this on. The first is personal. Everything is based on who we are as individuals. And it's really important that we have personal resilience, personal flexibility. Some people, that's just the way they are. There is an inherent characteristic that some people have where they just seem to be a little bit more robust. And some of us are a little bit more softer and sensitive. But we can develop that character through the use of emotional literacy or emotional intelligence. The basics of emotional literacy start with self-awareness, what's going on in here and why, and then the ability to self-moderate or self-modify so we can change ourselves intentionally to develop a level of resilience that wasn't there initially. And it requires the exercise of will. In England, we would use the phrase bloody minded. I don't know if that's a bad phrase to use over there. If it is, I apologize. But just to say, I won't be beaten by this. I am going to come through this. I know I can do this, and I'm going to choose to make it so. So there's ways of developing personal resilience that start with who we are, but developing intentionality in order to help ourselves become more flexible and more resilient in the face of challenge. If we're running projects and programs, there are certain factors which can help us to retain or develop flexibility and resilience in our projects and programs. Having very clear objectives is essential. Know where you're aiming. When the winds are blowing and the tides are going, you need to know where you're supposed to be at the end so we can make sure we adjust our track to get there. Appropriate levels of contingency, a management reserve so that we can fit those in and use them when they're required. Processes which are flexible. We don't have to have 3 signatures on every document. There are ways of flexing, of crashing the program and so on. And of course, strong change management. So when things change, we have a process that enables us to deal with it. What about businesses or organizations? The biggest contributor to organizational resilience is a shared corporate culture. To know who we are, to know what our values are, to know why we're here. What is it about our organization that makes us who we are? And then processes within that which are robust, which we can use in the face of different influences and changes, things that might threaten to blow us off course, because our values are grounded in who we are. And then lastly, in terms of society and nations, again, a strong national identity is really important and helpful. If we're facing pressures on our nation or on our society, understanding what our values are and who we are will help us to stand firm in the face of change, in the face of disruption, and coherence across our society at all levels. So we don't have them and us in different ways. We don't have divisions politically or socially. We can make sure that we stand together in our society so that when the winds of change strike us, we know what we can do. We know who we are. We can stand firm. Identity is a really interesting thing. It exists on multiple different levels. For example, if you ask me about my nationality, you might think I'm a Brit. You might think I'm British. Well, of course, I am British. I'm a member of the United Kingdom, a citizen of the United Kingdom. But within the United Kingdom, we have 4 nations. So I'm not just British, I'm English. And English is different from Scottish, Welsh, and Irish. But I'm not just English. Within England, there are different identities. There's North England and South. I'm a Southerner. And within the south of England, I'm not just a Southerner, I'm a Londoner. And within London, there's a difference between those who live in the north and the south of the city. I'm a North Londoner. And within North London, it depends which soccer team you support. A very clear identity is either Spurs or Arsenal. I'm a Spurs supporter. So identity has multiple levels, and it's important to be coherent across these levels. Depending on who I'm talking to, I'll present as a citizen of the United Kingdom or as a Spurs supporter from North London. And it depends, I know who I am, and that helps me to be resilient and flexible in the face of change. So all of these things on different levels of personal, projects and programs, businesses and organizations, and societies and nations, there are well-developed ways of developing resilience and practicing flexibility. And if we wanted one word to summarize all of these things, it might be the word agility. I'm not talking about agile project management here or organizational agility. I'm talking in the general sense of the word, the ability to flex our position depending on where we want to be. So that's really important. And there are practical ways that we can develop based on who we are, what we do, our organization, and our national characteristics. So let me wrap up with just a few final thoughts before we give time to questions. Change is coming, change is here, and it's very volatile. Whether we call it VUCA or danger, whether we call it black swans or ontological uncertainty, there's constant change, there's constant challenge for us in how we move forward. We can't control change. If we can't control the tides of change, we can at least learn to build better boats, boats that will survive, boats that will be stable, boats that will be resistant and resilient and flexible as we face those tides in the future. It's really important for us to understand this about black swans and to develop flexibility and resilience personally in our projects and programs, businesses, and more widely in society, because black swans are coming. We can't see them. This is the problem. They're inconceivable and unpredictable, but we know they are coming. There will be more. When they come, they're invisible until they arrive, but when they come, their effects will be huge and their effects will be unpredictable. And it's really important to recognize that not only we can be ready, but we must be ready. And hopefully some of the ideas I've shared in this presentation will give us some ideas that we can use in order to move forward in the face of the black swans that are coming our way. Black swan hunting is a really important exercise. What we need to do is to kill them, capture them, embrace them, deal with them before they have the opportunity to really impact us negatively. So I hope you found that useful. These are my contact details, and I'm happy to take contacts later on, to take questions later on. But if you found that useful, that's great. If it's raised any questions, then I'm very happy to take those now. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand back to Melinda. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hillson. Let's do a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. Excellent presentation. I noticed at the end that you turned that black swan into an opportunity. You looked like you became friends with the swan. So at this time, I would like to go ahead and turn it over to our student moderators to read the questions in the chat. So I believe, Patricia, were you going to begin?
All right, sounds good. I'll begin. So I actually had a question, so I figured I'd go ahead and start, and then we can start with the chat. In the US, we have this kind of discord between maintaining conservative notions, not really wanting to change, versus those who kind of go with the flow and want to adapt and be more flexible. How would you say would be the best way to kind of help move that along, and so we can get better flexibility and move towards being better prepared for black swans?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you say conservative and progressive, we're not going to use those terms politically, are we? No. Okay, because small c and small p, they're both really important. So we need to retain what is good, and we need to explore what is different. And it's really important. The goal of a nation is to protect its heritage, to preserve its heritage or the past, to protect the present, and to secure the future. And in order to do those three things as a nation or as a society, we need to have that conservatism that says these are who we are. These are our long-standing values. This is part of our legacy. we need to conserve those things. We need to protect them and we need to fight for them. But if we stay exactly where we are now and the world changes around us, we'll become irrelevant, we'll become out of date, we'll be overtaken. And so clearly we need to progress in a progressive way. It's about understanding that, what we must have and what we need to have coming forwards, going forwards. So I think it's a balance. And that's why it's important not to take the political flags because people tend to be one or the other. I would say from a societal perspective or from a national perspective, well, personally too, we need to have a blend of both conservatism and progressiveness. So we're holding on to the things that are good, the things that are still valuable, the things that define us, and we're open to things that will help us to develop into the future.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Lindsay, would you like to read next question in the chat?
Yes, I have a question from one of our hosts, Dave Wood. He says, Dr. Hillson, you discussed some global causes. Does the lack of cooperation among nations, for example, Russia and China censoring the internet, American nationalism, Brexit, etc., increase the likelihood and severity of Black Swan risk?
Yeah, Dave, that's I don't want to be what don't I want to be? You know what I don't want to be. Yes is the answer. I think these things are all part of the context within which we're living, and they're things which introduce uncertainty, which are disruptive. They are not black swans in themselves because they're all facts. So the things that you mentioned, like Brexit or what's happening in China, these things are facts which we can see and we can measure and we can track and monitor, but they could give rise to black swans. So in terms of the characteristics that the IRGC report, the emergence of risk, 10 global causes, some of these things fall into those categories. And so we do need to track them, and they certainly do make black swans more likely. What those black swans will be, we can't see. For example, you might imagine that there could be a global alliance between America and China coming out of the COP26 meeting in Glasgow next week. Really? Could that ever happen? Inconceivable. And then it happens. These things, we can't imagine what they are, but the fact that there are big, there's big movements around us in the context certainly makes it more likely that something will emerge that we hadn't foreseen. It's a great question, Dave. Thank you.
All right, so this next one says, let's see. So you had a kind of a housekeeping question. It says, if I can find it.
Yeah. It's about slide copyright.
That's the one. Yes.
Yep. The answer is yes. I'm happy to pass my slides to Melinda, and she'll make them available to participants later on. So that's not a problem at all.
Yes.
Gotcha.
We'll do that. Thank you.
All right. You want me to take this one, or Lindsay, do you want to?
Go ahead. You can take this one.
Okay. This one is from Janice. She says, as you speak with corporate CEOs, how receptive are they to taking action funding-wise, action work to prepare corporations to face future black swans?
Yeah, that's a very good question too. The answer is increasingly. I think because we've got the evidence in front of us from the coronavirus, from the lockdown, which I mentioned, from the supply chain problems which we're facing, from some of these things that we looked at in the past. And CEOs, boards, executives are definitely seeing that these things have happened in the past. There's no reason to expect they won't happen in the future. And you see that the organizations that were prepared for the disruption, whatever it was, were much more likely to survive. So, we just had the anniversary of 9/11. There were organizations which went out of business because of that event on that one day, and others which were more resilient to it because of their business continuity processes, because of their contingency approach, because they had backup plans for something. Nobody could have imagined that thing that happened. But despite that, there were some organizations which were ready for something, which would mean that they had, nobody could travel, nobody could go into the office, half the IT was down, all of those things. The organizations that were ready for that survived and the others didn't. And so I think, with recent experience, certainly CEOs are saying, yeah, we've seen it in the past. We know we've got to do something. The question is what to do and how much to do. And I think, they say that, you shouldn't let a good crisis go to waste. When something really bad happens, it is an opportunity just to remind people that we could prepare for the next one better than we prepared for the last one. So yes, they are becoming more receptive to taking action. The question is how much, and whether it's just enough, just a little bit to show willing, or really to commit to it. That's quite variable.
Thank you. I believe we have one more question. Lindsay, is that your turn?
Yes, we actually, I think, missed a question above the one she just read. So I'm going to go ahead and say that one. This one says, Dr. Hillson, can you please give us an idea which quantitative factors are normally considered for short-term risk and 3 to 5 year risks? And do you know where that information can be found?
Yeah, I saw that question go by in the chat. I wasn't quite sure. I wasn't quite sure what was meant by quantitative factors. Melinda, can you give me a hand here? What you might mean here?
I am actually not sure. Whoever asked that question, do you have a little more help for us here on the quantitative factors? Are you talking about doing like a quantitative analysis to try to predict the factors for the next 3 to 5 years, or looking for sources of reference?
I know we have some actuarial students on the visiting. So what advice might you have for them? I think that may be related.
Data that should be evaluated. Thank you,
okay.
Dave.
Yeah. So I think I would start with the World Economic Forum Global Risks Report, which I mentioned to you, which is available on the internet for free. So WEF, World Economic Forum. And within that report, there is quantitative data, which says, yes, that it's got the map of the global risks landscape that I showed with the likelihood and impact. And behind that, there are quantitative measures. And if we're talking about risks in the short term, the 0 to 2 and the 3 to 5 year timeframes, all of those have actually got proper predictive measures underlying them. Some of them have Monte Carlo simulations with ranges to talk about the severity of impact and so on. So most of the information, you would start with the WEF Global Risks Report and then drill behind that. All of the data is available on their website. In terms of other factors, it really does depend on which risk we're talking about, but most of them are quantified. And the data is available through the international bodies. It's not a very good answer because I'm not entirely sure what the questioner is after. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Next question.
All righty. So the next one is from Gracie Ray. She says, thank you for the incredible presentation, Dr. Hillson. I'd like to ask what you personally believe was the most catastrophic Black Swan event in your lifetime, and how did you handle it?
Yeah. Do you mean a personal Black Swan? The most catastrophic personal Black Swan was the death of my father. Very early on, I was 30, he was 57. He had a routine operation and everything was supposed to be fine, and he died on the operating table. And that was completely unforeseeable. He was fit and healthy. The surgeon told us everything would be fine, and it wasn't. That was completely catastrophic. How did I handle it? Really, that was down to the kind of personal resilience, the support of my family and friends and faith community, it was tough. But that was a personal catastrophic Black Swan. I hope you don't mind me sharing that. In terms of the next biggest that's had the biggest effect, I'm sure you're aware of the impact of heuristics, where things that are more recent seem to be bigger. And certainly the pandemic has had a major effect on my business and on our social arrangements, on our family and so on. And I think that has been really quite significant in the effects it's had in lots of different ways personally. And again, in terms of handling it, I think it starts for me with that personal resilience, with being able to fall back on the things that really matter. If you're an introvert, then introversion means you find your security in yourself, in your own values, in your own a way of thinking or your own beliefs. And I think that actually, for me personally, that helps me, rather than being dependent on other people's opinions or on other external metrics. So I think there's a number of things that we've seen that have been catastrophic in that sort of negative sense. And for me, it starts with personal resilience to help us handle it.
Thank you, Dr. Hillson. I'm going to read, I have a question from Jimmy Hart. It says, a recent report said that in the US, roughly 90% of stocks were owned by 10% of people. Is that a black swan? Was this foreseen broadly, as well as the tremendous wealth gap that continues to widen in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. That's not a black swan, because it is completely foreseeable, and it's been the case really for the last 2,000 years. So if you go back to Greece, or to even before that, to the Minoans in Crete, there have been huge disparities of wealth between the haves and the have-nots, between those who have invested, who hold the treasure in those early societies, literally the treasure, the gold and the silver and the precious gems and so on, and those who were the slaves and who worked for them. There's always been a wealth gap. And I think the question is whether society, how society deals with that wealth gap. If it's something which results in people exploiting other people with slavery, or if it's the sort of consensual arrangement, you might think to the way that the UK or Britain was organized perhaps 150 years ago, with working class, middle class, upper class, aristocrats, monarchy, and that whole class system, which actually worked because of consensus. And so people understood their role within the whole, and it worked rather better until sort of the 1920s, and then things were different for a whole range of reasons. But I think the idea of a wealth gap in a society is completely foreseeable. The question is what you do with it. In terms of how that's portrayed in stock ownership, I think that's a feature that's just a modern feature of the way that we organize our wealth at the moment. But it's certainly not, I would say it's not a black swan, because it's always been that way.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Sounds good. So we have one right here, and it is from, I believe sorry, chat. It's from Katie, and she says, Dr. Hillson, thank you for being here today. I'm interested in the effects of black swans on development of youth. Do you think that children developing during the COVID pandemic and other black swans will have necessarily developed more resiliency than those of us whose less formative years were less turbulent?
Mm-hmm. That's a fabulous question. I don't think we can generalize. I think in some societies, the children of the lockdown generation will have suffered because they haven't had that kind of social development. They've been held to their families or to a very small sort of sub-community, rather than being exposed to schools and clubs and all of those other things that children usually do. So those restrictions, I think, will, for some people, have been damaging. For others, it will have driven them, into a place of developing resilience. I think it's too soon to tell, really, certainly for the pandemic. But I think kids are incredibly resilient. It's part of that human nature. That's who we are. When you think of, how human babies are born, and the fact that we're completely helpless and hopeless when we start, and entirely dependent on our parents to manage all the risk for us. We're just victims of whatever happens around us. It's amazing that children ever survive at all, actually. When you think about the way that they start, they are hugely resilient, and children just seem to have rubber bones. They fall and they bounce back. But there are some things which are internally damaging. And I think some of the social effects of the pandemic and the lockdown will have big effects. Kids will have been driven into the internet, into the virtual reality, into the virtual world, which may have an unforeseen consequence further on down the line in terms of the way that they move into work, the way that they develop relationships, the way that they express themselves, or the input that they get. Instead of chatting with other kids over a milkshake down at the diner, they're all online somewhere in chat rooms, and we don't see that outside. So I think there are all sorts of factors. I trust in the resilience, the basic sort of human resilience of human nature in children and young people. But I think the effects will be quite patchy, and it remains to be seen how it turns out. But to be aware of it, to raise the question is really important, because now we can be tracking it, looking out for it in our own families, our own relations, our own schools and clubs and societies, and look out for those sorts of things and help our kids through it. There are huge mental health impacts from what's happened in the last year, and I think we need to be aware of that. But raising the question gives us the chance to see it. Now it's not unpredictable because you've asked the question, and now we can do something about it. That's a great question. Thank you.
Yes, excellent. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We are out of time. I'd like to actually give a virtual. You mentioned the difference between virtual world and real world. I would love to be able to hear the clapping right now of everybody in the room, but we're going to give a big yes. Can you hear it? Can you hear the virtual clap? We are so grateful for you being here today. Fantastic presentation, fantastic insight. So that we can go and build that flexibility, resilience, and agility, and be ready for those Black Swans in the future. Thank you again, Dr. Hillson. We wish you the best of success, and we hope to see you again around here. You said you like Nashville, and you said you're from Southern England. Well, we're from the Southern United States, so we're just like, come on.
Nashville is on my to-do list. I'm definitely coming back. So next time I do, I'll just come down the road and visit.
Please do. Please do. We would love for you to come and visit us. But with that, everybody, thank you for attending. I will get those PowerPoint presentations out to faculty who would like to share them with their students. And we have recorded this so we can make this available to our students internal to the organization who weren't able to actually be here today. So thank you very much, Dr. Hillson. Have a good evening.
Yeah,
good evening, and thank you.
Bye for now. Cheers.
Bye, everybody.